Glory Cloud Podcast, episode 105. Well, stay tuned for some more glory in our midst this week. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Pastor Todd Bordeaux. Welcome back, Todd.
Thanks, Chris. How you doing tonight?
I'm doing well. I'm really looking forward to continuing on in glory in our midst. I understand we have lots and lots of words to cover this episode.
Yeah, this is a first for us because, the way Meredith wrote this chapter, we are going to spend the whole episode tonight on one word.
Oh, only one?
One word. So I don't think we've ever done that before.
Okay. Well, I won't spoil the surprise for our listeners. We'll wait to find out what that one word is. Before we dive right in, I'll just run through the regular housekeeping, reminding our listeners that we do have our show notes page at meredithkline.com/podcast. And you can find the resources that we mentioned during the course of an episode, ranging from scripture passages to books. And it does help me out a little bit when you order from the website, when you click on the link and order there. Also, if you would please give us a 5-star rating on iTunes and subscribe to the podcast on whatever podcatcher you use. Both of those things help boost our visibility to others as they are looking for good theological content in their podcasts. And the last time I looked, I was blown away by the number of ratings that we have. I think we were closing in on 100 ratings, which is way more than twice the number of ratings that other podcasts in our genre have. So thank you to our listeners for doing that. I know that we have more than 100 listeners, so if you haven't done it yet, please go and give us those ratings and subscriptions. And finally, if you have the means to pitch in a little bit of money to help us cover the monthly cost of hosting the audio files, you can find a donate button at meredithkline.com/podcast on the right-hand side of the page, and any amount that you can give is much appreciated and really encouraging to Todd and me. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Todd to get our conversation kicked off.
Well, for those who are following along with their books open with Kline, we are on page 6. And if you turn there, you can see the word we're going to be considering is the word deep, or deeps, because we are in Zechariah 1:8. And as we explained last week, this is really the first and key vision that sets up the rest of the visions of the book. So if you can understand 1:8, and it's a very brief vision, then you'll know where all the other visions are going. So Kline is going to spend a lot of time unpacking this particular vision. And so let me just read it again. During the night I had a vision, and there before me was a man riding a red horse. He was standing among the myrtle trees and here comes our word. I'll read in the NIV, ravine. Behind him were red, brown, and white horses. We talked about last week what it meant to be a rider on a horse in the military arena that this brought up, and what the angels as the Lord of hosts would be doing. But Kline wants to focus on that word translated ravine in the more modern translations. The King James and the older translations have in the bottom.
Okay.
And the word in the Hebrew from the Masoretic is Mesula. It's the consonants Mem, Samech, Lamed, and Hey. And so Mesula is also used in Zechariah 10:11, referring to the depths, the deeps, or the depths of the river. And so the idea is not a ravine as if it's a dry ravine and the myrtle trees are in the ravine. The idea is we're looking at the depths of a sea. And in Psalm 68:22, Kline points out the same word in the Hebrew. It says, from the depths of the sea. And the preposition there, the bet, is by the sea. And so Kline says, instead of translating it like the modern ones do, as a dry ravine, that would be the picture, that you have the Lord of hosts on a horse, and he is instructing his angels on horses among myrtle trees, and the myrtle trees we'll consider next week. But here's the key: by the sea. Now you can understand why some interpreters would want to picture it more as a ravine, because in a natural sense, it makes more sense. If you're going to have trees, then it makes sense, at least in a ravine, you can actually picture that in nature. Mm-hmm. Where it's a little more difficult to picture trees in the middle of the ocean. And so, but it's important to remember that visions are like dreams. Visions or dreams don't really work according to the laws of nature. Think of your own dreams. They're very fluid. They're not limited by the laws of nature. And we see that, of course, even in the visions in Revelation. You know, we have Christ holding the 7 stars in his right hand, and then Christ putting his hand on John. Then you might say, what happened to the 7 stars he was holding up? Well, visions are like dreams. They can change, they're fluid, they don't follow the laws of nature. So we don't need to have a ravine simply because it makes more sense. We should go with what the original Hebrew said, and that is how it's used as the sea. And so you have myrtle trees along the deep or the depths of water. And Kline reminds again, the Septuagint has a very strange interpretation, the mountain of the shadows. Mm. And they're putting the vowels in to say masalu. And that would be, Kline discourages that just to stick with the Masoretic text in the older Hebrew with deeps, and don't worry about whether it fits sort of a natural view, because it's simply not how visions work. Mm. And so he's going to show then why seeing it that way and understanding it will really open up the theology of the vision and really the theology of the rest of the book, is understanding in the midst of the sea. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on that before we look throughout the Bible at the sea?
Yeah, I don't want to steal thunder from what's coming up, but I think that when you understand what Kline is so concerned about here in terms of the depths taken together with what we talked about last week in terms of the color of the horses being an imagery of fire and judgment and the presence of the Lord, I think those go together better than with a ravine or a mountain of the shadows. So I'll just set it up that way.
Good. Yeah. And what Kline is going to begin to do is use biblical theology to bring out the importance of the sea with similar images. And so he starts with the Exodus, and he notes that the same type of things in the Exodus, as well as especially the parting of the sea, you have as in Zechariah 1:8. So with the parting of the sea, you have figures of horses, of course. You have God's glory cloud presence, which has brought them to the Red Sea. Then you have the sea itself. And so all the images that are in Zechariah, we also see in Exodus at the Red Sea. In Exodus 15:5, we actually have our word, mezolot, there, the deeps. And it's the deeps that covered Pharaoh's horses and chariots.
Okay. So it's the deeps of the waters.
Yes, the deeps of the waters cover the enemy's chariots and horses.
Okay.
And Kline points out that in Zechariah 10, when it pictures a future Exodus event, it's described as the deeps of the Nile drying up. And of course, the Nile of Egypt, it's It's again, you have that imagery of God defeating the deeps. The water in a certain area typically represents that area. And so the deeps or the depths of the Nile would represent the Egyptians themselves as the enemies of God's people. God defeating them in order to bring his people to a safe place. And so Kline moves from there to the crossing of the Jordan. And what do we have before the Israelites enter the Jordan River? We have the angel of the Lord who appears to Joshua. So you have the angel of the Lord in Zechariah 1:8 next to the depths of water. And what separated God's people and Joshua from entering the promised land? Well, it was the Jordan River. Unless God dried up the river, unless he defeated that which kept them from the promised land, they couldn't cross. And so the angel of the Lord comes. And the idea, of course, is that God himself, with a powerful act, will defeat the enemies of God's people, here symbolized by the depths of the river. And so in both Exodus events, the crossing of the Red Sea and then sort of a recapitulation of that with the crossing of the Jordan River, a theophany of the Lord appears to part the depths of the sea or the waters for God's people. And that's going to then set up, at the Exodus, the Zechariah vision.
Okay.
Any thoughts on that before we move through some other parts of the Old Testament?
Well, just a moment ago, I said that the deep or the depths paired up well with the imagery of fire and the color of the horses. But if the deep is an enemy that Israel needs God to defeat, it almost seems like maybe a type of death. Just as Pharaoh might be sort of a type of the devil, the deep almost seems like death that Israel needs God to defeat on their behalf.
Yes, and Kline will bring that out later, that even the flood waters for Noah, that was death. It was the death for all the other people and the animals. And so God had to bring Noah through a death ordeal and then raise him, in a sense, to new life through the ark.
Okay.
And of course, in the new covenant, death is our enemy, isn't it? That God must defeat.
Right.
And so before Kline, again, goes back to Zechariah, he's going to go even earlier than Exodus, and he goes back to Genesis 1:2, because you have the glory spirit hovering over the deep. The waters are covering the earth, and God is going to create image bearers and put them on a dry land, a place to live. But to do that, he needs to divide the waters. He needs to defeat the depths of the waters. And he needs to order the realms in order for God's people to have a place to live. And so Kline points out that the primeval deep was transformed by God's powerful act of dividing the sea to now become a double source of life. Because after that, you have the waters above, which is rain, and then the waters below, the subterranean lakes and wells and rivers, both becoming a source of life. So God brings what would be a source of death. God's people would not have a place to live if they were drowned. So God divides the seas, creates man, puts them on dry land, and then the waters then become a source of life. And so right away we see that what's happening in creation is eschatological, it's typological, it's already pushing us ahead to the Exodus event and finally to the work of Christ. And Kline points out that the water that would stop people from living on dry land, God's image bearers, then becomes a river flowing through Eden. Again, God bringing that which is negative, that which is keeping God's people from their land, now becoming a source of life. And of course, that river has an eschatological antitype, which in Revelation 20 and 21 is the river that flows through the new heavens and earth, right?
Right.
The eschatological Garden of Eden. And so creation will unfold in Genesis 1 as a type of something greater to come. So eschatology doesn't only start in the of Eden with the sign of the eschaton. It really starts in creation itself. Because as Paul points out, the first creation is temporary and pointing ahead to the new creation, which is eternal. And so Kline summarizes the first creation of the dark and the depth of the water that needed to be subdued and divided. And once God does that, he defeats the water in a sense. The kingdom of God now emerges, a place where God's image bearers can live and build the kingdom. And now they have a safe place to take dominion and rule. And you also have a cosmic temple for God. Of course, Eden was the cosmic temple, at least on earth, as a picture of the glorified temple. And all this, even from Genesis 1-2, is you have a theophany in a sense of God, God's glory spirit, hovering over the earth, and God separating the waters. So you see the sovereignty and power of God over the depths, over the deep. The deep then, the deep waters will represent all evil, all power that would get in the way of God's image bearers, fulfilling their calling and God's destiny for them to live in his kingdom. And so all this to say, we haven't even got to Noah and the flood yet. And all this is the biblical theology that is setting up the vision in Zechariah 1:8.
Okay.
Any thoughts on creation?
Do you think it's problematic that there's an image of, I guess, evil here in the second verse of Genesis 1? It seems a little early for evil to be on the scene.
Only if we see it as a picture, not actually evil in itself, but just the way later throughout the Old Testament and the New, how the deep waters becomes an image for evil. So it's not that evil existed before the fall, but we do have a picture that God would use later on throughout the Bible as a picture of evil.
Okay.
So as long as you keep it in the realm of picture and not that there is any actual evil in the creation itself or pre-creation in substance, then you're fine.
Okay.
Yeah, that's an important distinction, don't you think?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I mean, when we're talking even about grace before the fall, that would imply that there was sin before the fall. That does seem like an important distinction to make.
Right. And so Kline has moved from the Exodus and then to Joshua, and he's gone back to creation, and then he goes to the flood. Okay, so he moves to Genesis 6 and 8. The flood, and we've been through this back in Kingdom Prologue, is a recreation. First, it's a return to the deep covering the earth, and so it's a return to Genesis 1, because now instead of the waters being separated, the waters come together, the waters above and waters below. They come together to destroy instead of to create a place of life. And so you have a decreation, and then, of course, with the receding of the water, you have a recreation. And in Genesis 8:1, you have that Hebrew word ruach, which can be translated in the Old Testament either spirit or wind, depending on the context. In Genesis 1:2, it's the ruach, the spirit, hovering over the waters. And in Genesis 8:1, it's the ruach, wind. But we should see a connection to Genesis 2:1,
right,
that you have a new creation again. And so as the flood recedes You have a recapitulation of the creation order. You have the reappearance of dry land, and then the appearance of vegetation, and then animals, with the animals exit, and then man dedicates himself to God. So even the order is similar. So you have a destruction and then a redemptive reconstruction of the creation. And so in the deluge, in the flood, the deep, the water is a destroyer of life. It's that which threatens life. And it's not just a recreation, as we said before, but Kline brings out it's a resurrection. Symbolically, Noah went through the death waters and he came out alive.
Mm.
And so for God to bring us to his eternal kingdom, we would have to die and rise again. And in Christ, we do die and rise again. We rise in him, being united to him in his death and resurrection. And so, again, he's setting up how the deep, how the waters are used throughout the Old Testament that will then interpret this vision for us of the Lord and his angels on horses next to the deep. Any other thoughts? But we have a couple more places to go before we actually get to our passage.
And any question I ask would just steal that thunder. So I'm gonna let you move us ahead in the conversation here.
All right. Well, Kline moves on here, and he brings out a couple other places throughout the Old Testament. You have in the Psalms, like Psalm 18, Psalm 69, the water is used as that which destroys God's people, threatens to destroy them. And so you have the psalmist often saying, I was afflicted, the waters were overcoming me. I was, the image of a man drowning in the depths of the water. And he cries out for salvation from the depths of the water, like Jonah did, by the way. Mm. And God appears, and especially in Psalm 18, God appears as a mounted warrior, rescuing his people from the depths of the water. Reminding us again of Zechariah 1:8. God is a mounted warrior, mounted on the horse, about to rescue God's people. So the waters then are that which threatens God's people, but then water is used as a judgment over the wicked, because the deeps in the Old Testament end up being the place where God's people are rescued from, but then where the enemies are drowned in, like Pharaoh.
Okay.
And so even in the New Testament, Kline doesn't bring this out, but I'll add, when Jesus calms the sea, for example, that's not simply Jesus showing us that he's the creator who has authority over creation. It certainly is that. But we have to bring in all our biblical theology from the Old Testament, that Jesus is not just the Lord of creation, but he is the one coming to redeem his people from the evil powers, sin, Satan, and death, that hold them. Because the sea is not just representative of creation, it's representative of evil, of, like you said, death and sin and Satan. So Jesus is not just showing us who he is in that miracle, he is showing us what he has come to do for his people.
Okay, that's really helpful.
And then finally, that somewhat mysterious verse in Revelation 21:1 opens up for us, where it says, and in that time there will be no more sea. And often people have struggled, well, why wouldn't there be any waters or sea? I like the ocean, and the new heavens and earth. But if we remember what the sea has been symbolic of throughout the entire Old Testament and somewhat in the New, we see that this is symbolic of no more evils. No more enemies of God's people will exist. Nothing that can keep them from God or their calling as inhabitants of the new creation. So we shouldn't think in terms of literally it's all going to be dry land. We should think in terms of symbolically what the sea has represented in all these images throughout the Old Testament.
That makes sense. I mean, they wouldn't have been as excited for a trip to the ocean as as maybe our friends in Southern California are.
Yeah, exactly. The ocean wasn't looked upon in those days as something fun. It was something very dangerous.
Yeah. And the Israelites were not really seafarers, right?
Right. Right. That was the place you heard about people dying.
Right.
Was the ocean.
Why would you want to go there?
Right. And so I mentioned we're about to get to our passage, but Kline is actually going to go first back to the Exodus on page 11. And he points out that the glory spirit reappears before the sea, like we said, as a message to Israel that the Creator, remember Genesis 1:2, the glory spirit is over creation, about to do something, is your Redeemer, the one that will defeat your enemies and bring you to the promised land. And so here is the Creator now about to accomplish a kingdom inaugurating recreation. He is going to divide the seas once again, the Red Sea, bring them through dry land to his place. And Kline brings out in Deuteronomy 32:10 and 11, that's the picture. In a desert land, he found him in a barren and howling waste. He shielded him and cared for him. He guarded him as the apple of his eye, like an eagle that stirs up its nest and hovers over its young, that spreads its wings to catch them and carries them aloft. Now, Kline will point out that there are two words here that are found in Genesis 1:2, and it's the only other time in the whole Bible where these two words are found in the same verse or verses, and that's wasteland and hover. And so in Genesis 1:2, you have the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God hovered over the deep, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so now here you have God in an image of an eagle hovering over his people, right? And these people are found in a barren and howling waste. There's that word, wasteland. So again, the image returns from Genesis 1 to what God's about to do in the Red Sea miracle. And again, in the Jordan River, you have the dividing of the waters. You have the dry land appearing, God bringing his people through to a promised land. In creation, it was Eden, was the land where God's temple would exist. And Adam was put in a covenant of works in Eden. Now, Israel, here comes recapitulation, right? Here comes the return of Eden. Israel is brought through the waters to a garden land, and they're placed in another covenant of works on a typological scale, where just like Adam, they will be told if they do not obey the law, they will be exiled out of the land. Mm-hmm. So here Israel becomes another Adam in a typological sense.
Exactly.
And so before we get to our verse, Kline does bring out that the ancient mythologies of the time, you have, like the Babylonian myths, the hero god goes into the sea, and like you said, to the ancients, the sea was a terrible, dangerous place. The sea represented the god who hated mankind, wanted to drag them under. And so their hero gods would always go into the sea and defeat the god of the sea. So the people of that god would be able to continue to live. And so Kline points out what the biblical authors are doing is they're demythologizing those stories, but they're still sort of using the imagery of those stories. But now it's the true God who defeats the powers of the sea in a true sense by defeating the enemies of God's people. Now, all that Kline is doing to set up the vision in 1:8, because the vision in 1:8 doesn't have to be explained. We're not told what the sea represents. And typically throughout the visions in Zechariah and also in Revelation, anything that hasn't been used throughout the Bible already as a symbol is explained by the angel.
Okay.
So that tells us, for example, in the book of Revelation, almost every symbol is not explained because it's found in the Old Testament. But when a symbol is introduced that's brand new, it's explained. So John will either ask the angel, like in Revelation 1, we're told what the 7 stars represent. The 7 stars are, right? Because the visions are somewhat new. And so because we're not told what the sea represents, we are expected to know from the rest of our Bibles what they represent. And so we don't have to be told. And that's why Kline takes so much time to go through the rest of the scripture to bring us to Zechariah 1:8 and the waters here.
Okay. That makes sense.
So that was probably the longest introduction to a word in one verse.
Still setting up the first vision in the book of Zechariah.
And not only the first vision, the one word in the vision.
Right.
But it does show the beauty, glory, and importance of biblical theology, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, we just canvassed the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and I think that was a rich expedition that we just took.
Yeah, maybe our listeners would be encouraged to purchase the Dictionary of Biblical Theology, which simply takes all these themes, just any theme that's used throughout the Bible, and traces it from the Old to the New Testament. So if you don't have that book, preachers, I would strongly encourage you to get it. So for example, if I wanted to look up sea, I would just go through the dictionary, SEA, it's all in alphabetical order. And it takes me through all the verses that use the sea in a symbolic sense and explains them. Or, for instance, next week, we have myrtle trees. Well, how are myrtle trees used throughout the Bible symbolically? Well, I would go to M, myrtle trees, and see that. So it's a wonderful resource.
Okay. And you make use of that quite a bit in your ministry?
I do. Yes, I have.
Okay. Well, we'll link to that on the show notes page then.
Great. Okay, now we're finally at 1:8, and we've spoken so much of it. When Kline actually gets to 1:8, he doesn't spend a lot of time on it because he figures you already know what it means.
Right.
And so Kline points out that the similar visions of that time, in the time of Zechariah, was when Daniel and Ezekiel were alive, and their visions that God appeared near the river. But that would be the river, for example, in Babylon, in Daniel's case, or in Ezekiel. And the river, again, always represents the nation the river is in.
Okay.
And so Kline points out, now remember when Zechariah was written. It was written when the first exiles had returned to Jerusalem. They were about to start rebuilding the temple, but the world was still under Persian control. So Israel was not ruling anything. They were servants of a pagan kingdom, like they were before the Exodus. Obviously, some of the analogies fall short in the sense that they weren't under incredible bondage compared to the Exodus. But in a general sense, they were still under Gentile control. They could not live the theocracy they were called to live at that time. And they certainly had to be very careful because they were powerless. The enemies and the Gentile nations around them could defeat them. They really had no army, and they could do whatever they want in a human sense. So in a sense, they were slaves. And Persia, Kline reminds us, in Daniel 2, is that second beast power, that second kingdom of the dream that ruled in the name of Satan, in the name of the beast.
Mm.
And so it is in the water, in the river of Babylon, that God appears in a theophany with a prophecy. And so in the same way, in this vision that Zechariah gives, God appears on a horse as the angel of the Lord in the midst of the deep, of the sea. The sea then representing the Persian nation and all the nations and all the communities around Israel that they feared and that could easily defeat them in a human sense if they wanted to and could persecute them. And so you have a vision that the divine presence was with the Israelites in Jerusalem. And in verse 12, of course, the angel asks, "How long, Lord?"
Mm.
And so the vision is showing us that God's timing is planned by him. He knows when the enemies will strike. He knows what he will have to do to ensure that his people are safe. His kingdom will be built. And so what we have here then in this vision is the presence of the warrior over the sea, over the enemies of God's people, as a token of coming power and deliverance and victory. God will build his temple. God will protect his people. God will bring them to that final eschatological kingdom through defeating the sea. He will bring his people through to dry land, and he will build a permanent kingdom for them, and he will defeat evil. And so, on a very temporary typological sense, he will do this by making sure that the temple will be built. And so, at least in the picture, they will be in their own city of God, and they will have a temple of God's presence. But of course, because they're still under the law, because they're still under the covenant of works between God and Israel, they will be exiled out of the land again. They will be defeated. But when Christ comes, the temporary turns into the eternal at that moment. And Christ will bring in all these, but all these things picture. Christ will defeat the sea for us. He will defeat sin, Satan, and death on the cross and in his resurrection. And God will bring us through to the new heavens and earth, where that final temple will be. So everything that happens in a temporary sense in Zechariah's day will be fulfilled through the gospel. And so Zechariah ultimately is looking ahead to the work of Christ and what he would do finally for his people.
That's amazing.
A lot there,
yeah.
But go ahead.
No, just that's amazing, and it makes me really eager to continue on in the book. So I'm already looking forward to next week's discussion.
Yeah, and just think of all that we've been able to bring out of the Bible from one word.
I know.
You know, it reminds me of sometimes when we doubt, and we all doubt, we all have those times at night, we ask ourselves the question, what if? Well, what if this isn't all true?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways God uses to assure us is not only inwardly by the presence of the Holy Spirit, but outwardly by the way his word is organized and comes forth. When you see all these connections throughout the Bible written by men separated by hundreds and even thousands of years, you just see the impossibility of not a divine overseer, a divine author of the Bible. It just all weaves together so beautifully and seamlessly that you think, wow, this is so glorious. No group of men who never met could have put all this together.
Yeah, it's just impossible for it to be some sort of conspiracy across millennia.
Yeah, so the evidence is not just an inward sense of God's assurance. It is the beauty and glory of the word that is evidenced in what we see. And that's sometimes, for me, what does it. It's not simply the philosophical questions of how could I be here without a creator? But even more specifically, that brings us to the Christian faith is, how could man have written this alone? There's no way.
Right.
And when I do biblical theology, that's really where the authorship, to me, of divine authorship is seen most clearly.
And I think that's definitely an aspect of what really impressed me and made me so excited sitting in Kline's classes, is that you could see how the entire Bible really was one story. There were lots of facets to it. You could, turn it and see different features and aspects and things like that. But especially having looked at Genesis 1-2 and Revelation 21 and, everything in between, on this theme of the deep and why it's so important and significant. You're not going to get that from an author who hundreds or thousands of years later said, well, I'm going to sit down and write, the next addition to this library of books. And, here's hoping it fits, and nothing like that.
Yeah, exactly. Let me make one more pastoral point and then we can close.
Yeah.
And that is that the assurance we need, we've talked about how these visions give God's people assurance. And certainly we're told as Christians that we are to fight sin, repent of our sin, and we do have a role to play in our sanctification through submitting ourselves to the means of grace, prayer, and fighting sin. But here we have in this vision a bigger picture that we need to remember, and that is God is really the one fighting our sin. He is the one on the horse, because our sin is our enemy as Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And sin seeks to destroy us. And so these visions remind us that ultimately God is the one who will defeat our sin. It's not as if God is watching us and saying, well, you better fight because I commanded it. And if you don't, you're going to prove yourself this, or you're going to, God is promising his true people that he will fight their sin. And the reminder, and I often say to people in my church, God is more concerned with your sanctification than you are. And so that's important to remember, because we are still weak. We don't quite fight our sin as well as we should. We always are dealing with our own weakness. But God is more concerned with our sanctification than even we are. And so God is going to make sure we stay sanctified. He's going to make sure that sin doesn't defeat us. Whatever it takes for him to do, he will do it for his people. And so it's not me fighting this battle with God watching and saying, you better do this. It's this assurance that God will, by his Spirit, do this in me.
So my apologies to those who know nothing of mixed martial arts, but he's not the coach on the outside of the octagon yelling inside, hey, get your act together, put your hands up. That kind of thing. He's the one doing the actual fighting.
And for those of us not familiar with martial arts, we did see the movie.
Right.
And so we remember Chuck Norris in the octagon. All right. Well, that may be a good place to close, and we will move on into the vision next week.
So next week is myrtle trees.
We may go a bit further, but we're going to start with the myrtle trees.
All right. Well, Todd, thank you so much for leading this discussion on the deep. That was really good.
Thanks.
All right, everyone. We would love to hear your thoughts, your comments about what we've talked about this week. You can email us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us. I am at Machen Guy. Todd is at T Bordeaux, and the podcast itself is at Glory Cloud Pod. And you can also join us at the Meredith Kline Facebook group. Just let the admins know that you listen to the podcast. They can get you added, and we will talk to you again next week.